So I uploaded the next module for the class, um, and you guys see it here. So module 3. So so it's here, and the next assignment is here as well. So this module is focused mostly on images and the different types of images that we'll use for our web design projects. So I think for some of you, this may be a review, but there's a couple concepts here that are really important when you go through the modules. So the most important concept is thinking about color, mode, and resolution for your files. So here I talk about resolution being points per inch or pixels per inch. So these are the two things you really want to make sure you follow as you go through all the assignments in this class, is make sure that your images are always saved at 72 PPI, or some people say dots per inch if you're coming from a printing background, but pixels per inch is what that stands for. So 72 is the resolution that you want to save all of your images at when you bring them into a web design project. And the color modes should always be RGB. So that's important. And as you go through this, I go through each of the major image formats. One of the things I talk about is lossy versus lossless. So if you ever hear the term lossy, that means you lose resolution, you lose data for certain types of file formats. And those formats are basically it's the JPEG format and the GIF, or some people say GIF format. So those formats are lossy, meaning when you save it, you have an option to compress the file to save space. And then there's another type of file that's called lossless. And lossless, you don't lose anything. And PNG files are lossless, meaning you get the same amount of quality when you save it after you save it. So those are two important concepts to remember. But all of this is here in the module. And I also talk about bit depth, and that's the number of colors based on bits per pixel. A lot of these concepts are from a time when the web was just beginning and color depth on a monitor was limited. You had low bandwidth, so you had to be very careful about the size of the images. And right now, that's really no longer the case, with the availability of high-speed internet, which is even getting faster and faster with like 5G coming out. So these are a lot of concepts that were established early on. The one thing, and I'm not going to go through all of this, you guys can go through this on your own. The one thing to get out of this, though, is when you save your files as a particular format and you have to make a choice about what format to save it as, if it's like a photograph, if there's a lot of color in the image, basically anything that's not a logo, I would say, just save it as a PNG file. If there's a decision to save something and you're deciding, the difference between a JPEG and a PNG, just save it as a PNG. And I'll show you here. I created this little animated GIF here. And in Photoshop, the PNG file is kind of like the de facto favored file to save your web images as. Even in the layers palette, and I'll show you this in Photoshop, there's a drop down where you can just say quick export as PNG. And that's put in there purposely because Adobe knows that PNG is going to be the most popular format and you'll be saving them all the time. So most of the time, I'm going to be asking you to save your files as PNG files for a lot of these projects. And that's kind of the whole point of having this section in the module. The last thing though, a really interesting file format is SVG, and it stands for Scalable Vector Graphic. And SVGs are great for logos and other things that are designed using Illustrator, using vectors. And what's really nice about an SVG file is that there's actual tags and there's actual code where you can make vector graphics within a web page. And there's kind of an example of it here where this SVG tag has a width and a height, and then you can actually declare the radius and the color of the stroke and the fill, all within the code within your HTML. So SVG is a really interesting format that we'll get into later on. So this module will have all the information about your images and what you should think about. And then I go through design principles, and I won't go through them tonight because I want to cover some things in Photoshop, but go through this module. This gives a good overview of different principles of design that you should be thinking about when you're working on any type of design. In particular, you know, the layout of a web page itself. And a lot of these will come into play when we start to talk about CSS, because and when I say CSS, that stands for Cascading Style Sheets. But right now, it's going to be hard to really take advantage of these concepts with HTML, because HTML doesn't have the ability to really get into different types of aspects of design where you can actually control like spacing and balance and have things positioned on different parts of the screen. HTML is limited because it's a top to bottom flow, and that's it. So these are things you can think about now, though, when you're thinking about the images that you're developing for a project. But once we're into CSS, then you can start to utilize these concepts for the actual web page itself.